Hello and welcome to another conversation in the Journalism and the Pandemic webinar series, which is brought to you by ICFJ's Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum and the Tao Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. COVID-19 has been framed as journalism's extinction event on a range of fronts, but it also represents a genuinely deadly challenge for journalists who are on the front line of reporting this problem around the world. And it's delivered a growing spectre of media freedom threats as well. And these range from the criminalisation of journalism through to the so-called fake news laws, through to official censorship. On this aspect of the Journalism and the Pandemic project, that being media freedom and journalism safety themes, we've also partnered with the Committee to Protect Journalists to involve their expertise. And today, among others, we're joined by their Advocacy Director, Dr. Courtney Radsch. So just to give you some context for this, as of today, the International Press Institute, IPI, has recorded 338 violations that inhibit the practice of journalism directly related to the COVID-19 crisis. So how are these new and emerging journalism safety and media freedom threats, and in some cases amplification of existing threats, actually manifesting around the world, given that conditions for media freedom and journalism safety vary, of course, internationally? And how can we respond to them practically and more effectively? Those are our key questions today. I'm Julie Posetti. I'm ICFJ's Global Director of Research, and I'm joined here by my wonderful Tao Centre collaborator, Professor Emily Bell, as I said, Dr. Courtney Radsch from CPJ, the Director of the Namibia Media Trust, Zoe Titus, and Mexican safety expert, Javier Garza. And Javier, you're in Mexico. Zoe, you're in Windhoek in Namibia, I think, is that correct? Emily and Courtney are in New York, and I'm in Oxford in the UK. So we represent a reasonable spread of people thinking about and working in connection with journalism and the COVID-19 crisis. So we're going to tackle, as I said, the key risks and discuss practical ways of trying to respond to these threats. And as usual, we're going to start with a discussion among the panelists. Then we're going to come to the questions that are asked by those who've pre-registered for this webinar. You can put your questions in the Zoom chat starting now, so we'll retrieve your questions from there. And of course, we're also streaming this on the Facebook group connected to the Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum and also ICFJ's Facebook page. If you're watching on Facebook, then put your questions in comments and we'll do our best to incorporate some of those questions too. So I'm going to start with a question for you, Courtney, because CPJ works across the spectrum of journalism safety and media freedom, and you also work internationally, including increasingly, as we've discussed before, emphasizing impacts within the US, which is where you're based. Can I just get you to outline for us what your own monitoring at CPJ has revealed, say, over the past 3 months of this pandemic really becoming entrenched in terms of its effects on journalism, just from a perspective of the range of risks and threats, and also, as I say, the international kind of diversity?
Sure, thanks so much, Julie. I'm actually based in DC. CPJ is based in New York, but as you said, we work globally. And one of the first things we did when the coronavirus pandemic started, and frankly, even before it started, was reporting on the crackdown in China, the missing journalists.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you because those shiny new earbuds are actually breaking up. So I think maybe we'll go without the earphones, if that's okay. It's just cracking up a lot, so it's very hard to hear you.
All right, so is this better?
That's better, yeah.
Great, okay. So as I was saying, right away we saw that, unsurprisingly, the press were in the center of the crackdown in China as it tried to control information about this new novel coronavirus. There are still journalists missing in China. They expelled foreign correspondents, and this has led for a tit for tat between the US and China. But as soon as the virus started spreading outside of China, so did the crackdown on the press. And I think one of the things that was, most surprising, although sadly not so surprising, was how quickly, as countries mobilized to combat the pandemic, part of their mobilization was to crack down on independent journalists, critical reporting, attempts to report on how the coronavirus was affecting given countries, as well as how the authorities were responding to that. And so what we saw is the proliferation in the use of fake news laws or laws against disinformation, including, standalone fake news laws, as well as health laws that included like disinformation provisions. And these were used to throw journalists in jail for reporting statistics that did not conform with the official version. It was used, for example, to criminalize disinformation, to impose hefty jail terms and fines. We've seen this in South Africa, but we even saw it in Puerto Rico, a US territory, which made it illegal for media outlets to transmit or allow the transmission of false information and face fines. So it was really shocking to see this proliferate around the world in democracies and non-democracies alike. And then, of course, we've seen the jailing of journalists. We've seen harassment of journalists at checkpoints, for example, by law enforcement officials who may not be familiar with whether journalists are exempt or not. It does appear that in most countries, journalists are considered exempt, meaning that they do not have to abide by quarantine requirements, though in many cases they have to provide substantial proof that they are exempt from those. So this can mean that freelancers and independent journalists can be at risk of not being able to either, show that they have the proper credentials and therefore also be at risk of assaults. We've seen that, a journalist, for example, in South Africa was filming the police enforcing a quarantine law. She was shot at. They came towards her despite the fact she was identifying herself as press. We've seen also attacks by the public in places like, for example, in India, where some people were afraid of journalists and what were they doing and who were they talking to? Were they going to hospitals? We have also seen the suspension of free speech guarantees, for example, in Liberia, in Honduras, which actually temporarily suspended some of the articles of its constitution, including rights to free expression. And we've seen very blunt censorship from newspapers being suspended, newsprint papers being suspended, restrictions on online comments. Tajikistan, for example, blocked websites. In Russia, they've blocked websites. Iraq suspended the license of Reuters because it did not like its reporting outside of official sources. Egypt kicked out a foreign correspondent and it's thrown several journalists in jail. So the threats are real, they are widespread, and they are affecting journalists in different ways because photojournalists, for example, need to be on the front lines. They can't work from behind a desk. Print journalists may or may not be in a different situation. And of course, as I mentioned, freelancers are at specific risk. So let me stop there so I don't take up the whole webinar.
No, I think what
the vast array of threats.
This is the thing, right? It's global. And the manifestations and exacerbations of existing problems are really, notable, both in terms of their number, but also in terms of their impacts. And we didn't even get on to the issues connected to whistleblowers and, protecting confidential sources associated with digital security risks. So we will come back to that, especially. And Javier, this is something actually that you're particularly expert on, and that is this theme of digital safety and security. So I'll get you to address that in a moment. But in the first instance, just if you could reflect for us on what you've learned working as a journalist and a journalism safety trainer in Mexico, which is of course known as one of the world's most dangerous countries to practice journalism. So what have you learned through those experiences and building on that expertise that you can apply to the various risks that Courtney's just outlined connected to COVID-19?
Thanks, Julie, and thanks everyone for the invitation. I think what I learned is what pretty much every journalist who has worked at a risk situation and who has taken steps in the past to try to mitigate that risk has learned. And it turns out that you can say that the lessons of the past 10, 15 years left us in a position to at least address the risks from covering the pandemic in in a more secure form. There are a lot of shades to this problem, but I will just say, for starters, that the main lesson is that when we have had to deal with violence against the media for years, especially violence coming again from organized crime and from security forces and political actors, journalists in Mexico increasingly have had to learn how to develop safety protocols and safety plans and how to plan ahead when what they are going to cover. Anything as simple as I'm going to go cover a crime scene because there was a homicide or a shootout, there needs to be a plan. And sometimes newsrooms have discussed what kind of protocols reporters need to follow when they go out and do that kind of coverage. And so that even those seemingly small, even routine lessons can come in handy, and I've seen some journalists for whom they've come in handy when they apply that to this particular scenario, and they say, okay, I'm going to go outside, I'm going to go to a hospital, for example. What's the basic protocol that I have to follow? Sometimes it seems like a non-starter or a no-brainer. I'm sorry. Sometimes it seems like a no-brainer that if you're going to go cover a hospital that is attending to patients with COVID-19, that you need to have some protection. But sometimes we don't really think about that. We don't really reflect about that. Maybe we follow some very basic measures, but other people don't necessarily do it at all. And then there is another problem, I think one that is not necessarily particular to Mexico. I think this is widespread, but this experience can serve as good as any other to illustrate it. And that is the lack of support from the news organizations. And this is from established news organizations. Freelancers are in a worse different position. But the lack of support to equip reporters with just the basic maybe face mask, gloves, disinfectant, the basic conditions for when they can maybe go out in the field and go do some reporting in a place that is hot with COVID-19, for example, and other things like, for example, health insurance or some sort of coverage, in case they get sick. So there is, on the one hand, the lack of institutional protection, but on the other hand, because there has been a growing awareness of safety, doing any number of risky coverages across the years, I think Mexican journalists were more attuned to the dangers that this posed, and at least with better tools to develop some basic protocols.
And I think you raised there the point about the sort of bravado that comes, I suppose, from being exposed to really extreme risk over a prolonged period of time. You have to be exceptionally brave to be a journalist in Mexico. And now you've got, the world's focused on these sort of fundamental safety measures designed to protect you from an invisible disease. I suppose that represents a particular challenge.
Yeah, that's true. But I think there is one thing that I think, this might happen across the world to journalists anywhere of all stripes. And that is, sometimes the emotion of going to cover the story makes you forget that you have to take some very basic precautions. I was doing some reporting the other day, talking to an epidemiologist who runs the team that goes out on the throughout the city to take tests for people who have symptoms or people who are suspect that they have COVID-19. It didn't dawn on me until the middle of the interview that I was probably talking to who was probably the person most at risk of contracting COVID-19 in my city, because she visited 70 or 80 people a day, maybe half of whom were actually sick. But it didn't really dawn on me, to maybe I should have taken additional precautions, because the story is the story.
Yeah. Zoe, if I can get you to talk to us about your experiences on the ground in Southern Africa. The Namibia Media Trust is one of the foremost media freedom organizations on the continent, of course, and Courtney has highlighted for us some of the risks and threats confronting journalists there. over the past 3 months, what in particular have you noticed in your work and monitoring are the main problems manifesting in your region? And you need to unmute yourself, Zoe. It's the old Zoom mute game.
Yes.
There you are.
There we go. There we go. Thank you, Julie. You know, Africa is considered the continent with epidemics, wars, and disasters. So for us in this part of the world, one would say this is business as usual. So I cannot really speak of new challenges. What COVID-19 has done has been to amplify existing challenges, and those would be threats from the state, new regulations in the name of curbing the pandemic, which have been used to constrict freedom of expression and media freedom, existing problematic legislation being used to silence journalists. But I'd say worrisome for me has been increasing attempts at censorship. And this is through attempts by governments to centralize information and access to that information, basically to attempts to control the narrative. Also, overzealous security personnel. We've had increasing attacks on journalists, but that has been from overzealous security personnel who are not trained on protocols and are often acting outside of official mandates. But I would definitely say that the biggest challenge, however, has been to media sustainability. Despite the fact that COVID-19 has prompted a significant increase in news consumption, it's basically sounded the death knell for print media especially. I think you yourself said in a recent Reuters report, your digital news report, that news businesses have had to accelerate their move to digital. Only problem is that they don't have the business models in place to monetize and sustain those. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I just point out that I'm affiliated with the Reuters Institute, but I'm not the author of that digital news report that you're mentioning there, although in other reports that I've written for them, yes, absolutely. This, what I think you're highlighting there, though, is what I have tried to reflect on, and Emily and others as well, and I'll throw to you next, Emily. So here's the microphone hit coming your way. But the issue of sustainability and viability of news organizations being really inextricably linked to media freedom and journalism safety. You know, you can't have one without the other. And I think that's probably coming into really sharp focus for us through this crisis. So Emily, when I say throw you the microphone, I mean for you to ask questions. And you're muted. I think we're all particularly exhausted this week.
There we go. Not muted anymore. Yeah, no, thanks, Julie. And I did want to sort of follow up on yes, some of those points. I just wanted to comment on that last point about sustainability as well, which is, you know, we think about a market like America as being, you know, a model of press freedom, and yet what we've seen in the past few months, and you know, a steady erosion over the last 4 years has been quite alarming. But we can't always see those threats to freedom. You know, we are aware of the protections that the First Amendment give everybody in the US, but they're only one protection. I was talking to an editor the other day who noted that because of the fundamental crisis of the economic crisis in news, for instance, there's a dwindling number of firms that will offer, for instance, libel protection and insurance. So if you want to take out libel insurance, even in the States, there are like basically a couple of options. What happens when you don't get competition in the market is that the prices really go up. And so lots of small newsrooms are now facing, you know, just the cost of basic protections. And what it means if you can't afford $400,000 a year to protect yourself against libel is you tend to pull back from the riskier stories. And I think that you know, kind of in some ways, those are sort of questions that I'd really like to hear from the panelists, which are, you know, how we're starting to think about what sort of models of journalism and sustainability we can support and create through policy and law and economic levers in the next year or so. What do we think? What do we think would be most useful in each of your markets, or from your experience of just looking at, you know, where the vulnerabilities for the press are? It feels as though there are so many problems at the moment. But if we were to advocate for or seek 2 or 3 changes which we think would really help protect the majority of journalists, what would they be? And these can be anything from sort of platform changes, because that's what I hear a lot, which is, you know, harassment, doxing, etc. If there was just a better way to be able to report those kinds of attacks at a low level, journalists might be sort of feel more comfortable doing their work. So I was going to go to Courtney first and just say, you know, what should we be advocating for? What's our best defense in the future?
Sure. So I think a couple of things to think about, and our canvas is global, would certainly be the decriminalization of defamation. I mean, the fact is that is still out there. And, you know, when you're facing defamation or libel charges that come with a prison sentence, that's very problematic. And just more broadly, the decriminalization of journalism, because there is a increasing trend towards criminalizing journalism through cybercrime laws, through false news or disinformation laws, through terrorism laws. That is a holdover from, you know, the 9/11 war on terror travesty that continues to impact journalists around the world. And so I think first thinking about how do we make sure that we decriminalize journalism and commentary. Secondly, looking at what's happening to local media and how to support them, especially freelancers realizing that, you know, a lot of local media outlets are trying to figure out how to be sustainable. You know, we are in the business of journalism protection, and what we hear is, you know, safety and money are related. The ability to secure your newsroom, the ability to make sure that the freelancers you're hiring are safe and know how to keep themselves safe, have economic implications. And so I think one thing to think about is, you know, when we're thinking about economic sustainability, that we have to include safety as a consideration. And, you know, this broader attack on the press as an institution and on journalism as a fundamental pillar of democracy, which we're seeing not only here in the United States at various levels of government, including, of course, our president, but we're seeing it around the world in democracies and authoritarian governments alike. And so, you know, this is a little bit broader, but I think we need to help people understand on an individual and community level why and how journalism matters for them, so that they really understand, since they probably won't need a journalist because there aren't very many of them left in their community, you know, that the police won't know who those journalists are, that they still understand and respect and value the fundamental role that they play in accountability and in the daily lives of people who get most of their information in one way or another through the news.
That's really been brought into stark contrast and also relief, hasn't it, as a result of the COVID-19 crisis? Because, as you say, you can draw this line from the crisis that was September 11, and this is probably the closest parallel. I think, Emily, some of the editors we've spoken to have said that to us, right? That this story and the way that it's evolved, and it's also kind of converged with the Black Lives Matter protests and various other super stories around the world, that there are those parallels, and what we're going through at the moment is another flashpoint, but it's a particular flashpoint in reference to safety and security and also media freedom. Sorry, Emily, did you want to take that theme up with others as well?
Yes, I did. Though actually, Julie, as you mentioned that, I was just going to ask as well. You know, we've had this survey in the field, which we're urging everybody to take. We only have a couple more weeks before we're going to close it down. So if you haven't had a chance to fill it in, please do, because we're hoping it will feed into kind of advocacy for the right kinds of resources. And just mentioning it there, Julie, piqued my interest, which is, I wondered what we were seeing in terms of the, we've got a couple of thousand responses to the survey in some detail, and what the issues are that are being raised by both editors and reporters in the field.
Sure, and just for anybody who's tuning in to this webinar without the context, that survey which Emily mentions, which it's important to keep drawing your attention to, is the survey that we are doing in multiple languages. We have currently around close to 2,500, I think, responses from around the Anglophone world to that survey, which ICFJ and the TAO Centre and also CPJ are partnering on. Just this past week, we've rolled that survey out now in Portuguese, in Spanish, in French, in Russian, in Chinese, and and did I say Spanish? I'm gonna miss a language, but you can go to the ICFJ website and find the survey in the language that's best suited to you. So please do go and fill it out. So I had a quick look, I was gonna say before we came on air, I feel like I'm back in my broadcast days, but before we joined the webinar, I had a look at the data. And I think it's fair to say that the issues that you have flagged, all of you in fact, are really evident. In fact, one of the points I was going to make is this issue of censorship, in particular shutdowns. So although this is an English language data snapshot that I'm referring to here, it's not a it's not a thorough data analysis. I'm just giving you some insights as the survey is still live, but that survey is indicating a substantial number of shutdowns in a broader range of countries than I would have necessarily anticipated. So, and I think by shutdowns, I don't just mean, but pull downs and takedowns as well. Sorry. So the internet shutdowns, yes, but the removal of content on the basis of justifications of pandemic level controls of the narrative, which various of you have mentioned, is emerging as a significant issue to be concerned about. The other thing that's really notable is the disconnect between the concerns journalists have about their own safety. That is to say, journalists identifying very significant concerns and resistance to reporting in the field based on their fear of contracting the virus and becoming spreaders within their own communities and families and networks, and the provision of equipment to protect them. So that's happening, and this is not new, right? So there's a lot of the work of media, of organizations devoted to journalism safety is focused on getting news employers to actually ensure that the journalists themselves are safe. But you can see from the data that while, for example, many news organizations are providing things like hand sanitizer and a basic face mask, very many journalists are concerned that they don't have access to things just like gloves, and goggles. And if they're going into hospital environments, forget about the full personal protective equipment because that's in such short supply. So it's only really the very big networks, for example, where the journalists are on the front line, that we're seeing evidence of people feeling well and truly protected in that regard. So I think those are the 2 points, in addition to a lot of concern being raised about digital safety and security, the chilling of communications with sources and escalation of fear because of the nature of journalism communications having to be so digital, the inability to do as much face-to-face work. So that's another point that the journalists have made, which again, probably not unexpected, but really interesting to see the way that's spread globally.
I wanted to pick up and ask both Zoe and Javier about the online aspects of this. So if I come to you first, because obviously, as you say, one of the things we've heard over and again, particularly from some of our African colleagues who we've had on this webinar, is disappearance of print has really sort of forced a sort of shift to online. I think that sort of we've taught digital security to journalists for a number of years at Columbia. We've kind of done a lot of work around how to get those systems working, etc. It does sort of shape shift in terms of how journalists sort of find themselves threatened by it. I was just wondering whether, you know, what the kind of, you know, if thinking about just a sort of an ordinary journalist on a beat, how well protected are those journalists in terms of doing their jobs now from a digital perspective? Because it's some of it is about sort of privacy, but a lot of it is also just about, you know, how free journalists feel to write certain pieces or have certain opinions. You know, so I was just wondering what your kind of perspective on that was.
In the case of Mexico, I would say that this it's manifold. It expresses in different ways. One is the skills of that journalists had in terms of digital security when doing their jobs. They've been improving. They're not optimal, but you know, I mean, I've done a lot of workshops, and it's really a never-ending process. Everybody knows that. But there have been improvements. I think that what the pandemic did really was accelerate some trends that we had already been seeing. And one of them, if, you know, for years, journalists, like many other people in every profession, had been migrating more and more of our professional lives and activity to digital platforms, chat, email, smartphones, whatever. I think this really accelerated it, because if maybe before the pandemic, we communicated with sources via digital device, chat, email, encrypted message, or whatever, maybe once or twice a month. Maybe now we are doing it once or twice a week, or once or twice a day. So it's really accelerating, and it's probably a trend that once it's accelerated will not decrease. So I think we are catching up. And in the process of catching up, we are going to be learning, as we have been learning, what are the best platforms for communicating with sources, for example. What are the best platforms for publishing? What are the best platforms for spreading something on social media? So we're really, that's a process of catching up. There is another trend that I'm seeing, which is also accelerated because it was going on before, and that is online attacks and online harassment. And that has been fairly common in Mexico. Not so much the takedowns or the blocking of web pages, although we have seen some cyber attacks against prominent news outlets like Animal Político, who has had cyber attacks in the past weeks. But mostly it's been online harassment with bots, mostly controlled from not organizations, because really they don't have a face, but they're really groups associated with the government, with the Mexican government. And that has been their primary source of attacking journalists that are doubting the official figures and the numbers that are coming from the government. They can do a strategy of manipulating the figures. I think every government knows that. But there is also reinforced with online campaigns against journalists who question those figures, or who question the government's response to the pandemic. I think those are the two main digital threats that we have been seeing, or the digital aspects of this that we've been seeing.
That's interesting. Zoe, is your experience similar?
Emily, I think the experiences are very similar. I am constantly surprised by the laissez-faire attitude journalists have with respect to digital security. Most journalists that I've spoken to, that is just part of the job and an issue that they will deal with, in due course. But at the same time, one must also make the distinction between the journalists, the general news reporters, and then the investigative journalists who are more exposed to issues of digital security and the importance of securing their sources. But in general, the concern amongst journalists themselves about digital security isn't really there, despite, I would say, excessive exposure and investment by media development organizations in digital security training and personal safety training. So that said, I agree with Javier on the issue of online attacks and the experience also looking at the gender dimensions of those attacks, because female journalists are more prone to be exposed to such attacks. And those attacks are so vicious. I mean, I have been following a recent debate, and it's difficult. I mean, we are, I think we should not put COVID-19 in a little box, but consider the broader environment that we are dealing with, because COVID-19, I do believe, has had an impact on how people are viewing the Black Lives Movement in the US. And it's in that context where in Southern Africa, there's very, very strong interest currently on social media around issues of race, identity, racial discrimination, and the nature of the attacks online on social media platforms have been such that, I mean, they would border on hate speech. So those are the kinds of attacks online against journalists specifically and media houses that I mean, we are currently seeing.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to ask Courtney on the back of that. Yeah. So the CPJ has brought out some great research. I know Lucy Westcott did some work on the effect just in the US and Canada, two relatively safe markets, one would have thought, on the impact of online harassment on female journalists and how it drives female journalists out of the profession. I was just wondering, sort of, just what does CPJ see in general in terms of how newsrooms are adapting to the kinds of attacks that Javier and Zoe have just described? Because often it makes a huge difference, I think, to a journalist whether or not you have a newsroom which is aware of what harassment can do to you, particularly if you're a journalist of color or if you're a woman, and it, you know, it's always surprising to me how few newsrooms seem to have really good processes for protecting those journalists and sort of understand what the things are they should be doing to help mitigate the effects of harassment.
I think on the one hand, we have seen an increasing recognition of the fact that online harassment is not just something that individual journalist, oftentimes a woman, oftentimes a journalist of color or minoritized in whatever community they're in, has to deal with on their own, and a recognition that actually this is endemic to the job of journalism, especially when you occupy, you know, a non-majority male position. You know, since I would say about 2015, the conversation really started, and that also coincided with a conversation in the industry about safety and about creating a culture of safety in the wake of the murders of Stephen Sotloff and James Foley in Syria. They were freelancers, and realizing that there was this gap in protection. And I mention those two things because I think that one of the reasons, you know, that we're seeing newsrooms increasingly recognizing that safety is part of, you know, that they need to create a culture of safety, that the ACOS Alliance was created for this, is online harassment. We have made efforts, and we are now seeing those pay off in terms of being recognized as a safety issue, being recognized as something that their staff need to be thinking about proactively. Some have been given specific training. Some are getting digital security. I know that we have definitely gotten some requests throughout the COVID situation that we're in right now, and especially with the protests in the US and elsewhere, for more training on how to deal with this, because they're really bearing the brunt. But I don't think it's yet embedded in the culture. It's not yet, as far as I can tell, you know, embedded into the onboarding process, you know, provided proactively. I think there is still a a differentiation between digital security and online harassment without always realizing that those two things are quite intertwined.
Right.
But I also think it's important that as we think about how newsrooms can address online harassment, we recognize that, you know, if you're in a newsroom in Brazil and you become the target of, you know, President Bolsonaro's tweeting, as with, you know, a former awardee of ours, Patricia, there's very little that you can do. You know, it's not like, you know, you as a newsroom, even if you have the best safety practices in place, you know, that's not going to mitigate the impact of a coordinated or inspired trolling campaign. So, you know, it's a mix. We're seeing, I think we need to see also in different countries, there are different legal frameworks that protect privacy and the provision of information online. In the US, it's very easy to get personal information, addresses, people's family members, etc. In places like Sweden, there are much greater protections and journalists can get access to those as public figures. So, you know, really varies. We're making progress, though there's always much more progress to be made.
Well, I should note on that ICFJ is in fact working with UNESCO and a range of other partners on a project examining online violence, and certainly our survey on the pandemic, we're looking particularly at gendered online violence against journalists and methods of, pardon me, excuse me, responding to it. But back to our survey, which is currently in the field, I didn't say this before, Emily, but that certainly has been an issue that we can see an uptick. We can see from respondents who say that they were already experiencing online violence, that experience has generally become much worse in the context of COVID-19. That's what our respondents are telling us. And I mean, I think it makes, you know, it's worth noting that here you have an intersection of disinformation and politically fueled disinformation, particularly conspiracy theories, all associated with a pandemic, which tends to escalate, you know, attacks at the best of times. And then, you know, you see these other sort of physical attacks manifesting as well. I just want to move the conversation back to solutions, and we've certainly been talking about solutions. But before we go to the audience questions, particularly as we see now, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning that this pandemic is coming in waves, and we're confronted by so many big stories currently. That preparedness and ability to kind of deal with the ongoing COVID-19 crisis is, you know, is wearying. And I imagine, you know, we're at risk of letting our guards down on a range of fronts. But right now, there's another cluster that Beijing is warning about in China of COVID-19. So it's almost as though it's doing, you know, it's started to do its second round, while it manifests with real force in places like Brazil, and India is increasingly problematic as well. So based on what we've seen and what we've learned over the first 3 months of this crisis, and bearing in mind this is a long haul, what do you think at a very practical level individual journalists and news organizations can be doing now? And I'll start with you, Javier, to improve their responses. And, you know, let's pick one particular area that you are most concerned about, say in Mexico or Latin America more broadly. What practically can be done to make responses to these problems more effective?
That's a really tough question.
I know.
I have to say that there have been remarkable efforts from different news organizations to especially investigate and expose the gaps in how the government is reporting the figures, the gaps in information about the deaths caused by COVID, hospitalizations rates, etc., with very little resources. And I think that this is really going to be what changes the future for news organizations. Retaking the concept of how the pandemic accelerated some trends, and as we see that the trend of economic decline, of the business model was already in full force before the pandemic, and the pandemic what really did is accelerated. Journalists learned that you can still do a lot of stuff with less resources. So maybe you don't have to spend as much money. but still do good reporting, because I've seen in some cases people doing some great reporting on very limited resources. But if you start seeing that collaborative tools, for example, or collaborative projects means that maybe you don't have to spend so much money on a particular kind of software, on a particular kind of programmer or analyst or whatever. Some news organizations are going to start seeing that maybe they can reduce their costs without necessarily reducing the quality of the reporting. The pandemic also has a great story. I mean, great story in the sense that this is really huge, and this is really the story of our lifetime for many journalists. It really heightens the sense of the need for journalism, and how, even though, again, this trend that we had been seeing before the pandemic of an erosion of the culture of press freedom, something that Courtney was saying about the press as a pillar of democracy, there had been a trend for years now, eroding at that, eating away at that. And maybe this is an opportunity to reverse that, because a lot of people are seeing the value of news organizations. Especially, I saw this trend in some cases in response to what initially was a lot of misinformation, a lot of fake news, a lot of garbage circulating in social media. I started seeing a lot of people actually educating themselves into how to distinguish that and how to discriminate what they were getting on social media. And they started recognizing or discovering again the value of trusted news sources. So I think that is also something that is going to be incredibly important going forward.
So what about your experience in Southern Africa? I mean, you mentioned yourself that African journalists are no strangers when it comes to reporting on pandemics. So back to those sort of issues around safety and also media freedom, what do you think can practically be done, whether it's by news organizations and journalists themselves or the civil society organizations focused on these things? You know, what are you seeing in terms of perhaps a gap between the lived experience of journalists and organizations dealing with reporting of, say, Ebola and now COVID-19, and how can that be kind of, you know, elevated to respond to the next wave?
Julie, I've spoken with a number of colleagues in Liberia who have been instrumental in sharing experiences with journalists from other parts of the continent in about how they covered Ebola and the public information campaigns that media houses undertook. And that is the important, I think, issue that has, I think, made the media all, has endeared the media in Southern Africa, specifically South Africa, to the public, in the sense that it is private and commercial media that have actually been leading with public information campaigns and also relief efforts. And that is important because, and I have to make mention of this, is because last year the Afrobarometer presented their study, and it was very clear that there is a decrease in support for press freedom by African citizens, and that was for us campaigning around media freedom and freedom of expression a concern because I mean of how highly we regard public interest media. So again, there is a renewed, I would say, trust in the media. But importantly, there is another issue that I wanted to mention before we wrap up. Something that I didn't mention earlier is, I mean, I've been speaking with a number of journalists in Namibia and around the region. And something that has really resonated with me is the mental health is a very, very serious issue right now. And it has been flagged, I think, as a looming crisis in newsrooms. But right now, in this COVID-19 context, COVID-19 has amplified that. And in this instance, mental health is now further affected by the lack of job security and pressures of being an essential worker. And, you know, journalists are also men and women, and whatever gender identity they pursue, but they too operate from households where there is gender-based violence and where there are school-going children, most of whom who are now home-based because schools are not open yet. And I mean, in our context, issues around access to internet is an issue for online education. So I just wanted to flag the issue of mental health. Well, it is very good. A number of media houses have responded in that respect. The other issue that I thought is something to mention going forward, and Javier, I think, spoke to that, is I have seen greater collaboration now in the last 3 months between civil society and media. And this is where, I mean, in African media at this point in time is preoccupied, I think, with the financial implications or impact of COVID-19 and how countries would restore the economies post-COVID-19, whatever shape or form that might take. And that is why there is increased reporting on those reform issues and also on issues of public spending. And this is where there has been greater collaboration between civil society and the media, which was not there before. And that, I think, is probably a positive move going forward and an issue that must be retained. I also wanted to mention, Emily, and both you, Emily and Julie, have mentioned that you are campaigning, you are currently doing the research, and you are campaigning for levels or opportunities of support for media, and ideally public interest media as of next year or the year after. My biggest concern is that unless newsprint, which is in our context incredibly important in the democratic space, unless they get support, I mean, right now, they won't be media to save 6 months later.
Right. Yes, I think that's a really important point. I read one reads very sort of conflicting reports about, you know, I think there was a slightly dangerous narrative out there at the moment that which tends to be perpetuated in markets like the US by a very small number of players that says, well, you know, it's not an extinction event for journalism. It's actually a chance to rebuild. I think that's actually not the case in many both countries and also communities in the States, that actually we are really seeing the sort of genuine disappearance. And there's somebody, Richard Cook, I think, on our Q&A made the point, or just reiterated the point, as you say, that actually if you don't have journalism in communities, then public health and public safety is one of the things which is most affected for everybody. You know, so again, we think about, we can't isolate journalism as a field from, you know, the rest of society, and that some of those things, as you say, sort of if you are in a market which is seeing a total disappearance of print media and communities who don't have access to that, if we are going to be living in a world where we have a pandemic for, you know, maybe months, maybe even a couple of years, that puts an enormous amount of strain on societies. And it's also, so it brings back to this question about whistleblowers as well, because I feel as though there's such a kind of a huge accountability story underneath so much of what we've experienced in the past 6 months or so. I was just wondering what our guests were thinking about whistleblower protections and the ways that we can protect our sources in this very sort of heightened and difficult environment.
So maybe we'll start with you, Courtney, on that, and I can pitch in as well.
I mean, you know did the report and guidelines on working with whistleblowers. I mean, I think what we've seen, for example, in this country is whistleblowers that have tried to use official channels and then gotten fired. That's certainly the case with some of the independent IG offices. But I think, you know, as we think about whistleblowers, as we think about what are the longer term implications of the coronavirus and its impact on journalism and the broader structure, and maybe we can revert back to this, is I do want to address the surveillance mechanisms that are being set up and the potential impact that that could have on journalists and press freedom right now, which we're not yet seeing, but which things like the US protests, and I'm sure protests elsewhere, as the Chinese system illustrates, can be used for any purpose once these systems are created if they don't have the legal and technical safeguards in place. And we're seeing, you know, the companies also get together to coordinate and collaborate around these technological contact tracing, or you know, they want to use different terminology, but basically we're creating all of these new technological and legal capabilities to track and surveil for legitimate health purposes. But just as we saw in the wake of September 11th and the so-called war on terror, which really is for me, you know, the learning point that we should be referring to, we have to make sure that there are very strict guidelines, restrictions on who can use that data, how it can be used,
how it's stored. Yeah.
You know, all of this, like, that needs to be put in place now. And, you know, there's some debate over, well, we can't wait, we need to get these, you know, these going. We have to do these simultaneously. You've got to see regulators and legislators step up to the plate and do what has to be done to protect the long-term freedom, because what we've seen in the wake, again, of September 11th is that surveillance capacity just expanding beyond anything anyone had ever imagined and being turned against journalists, right? I mean, that's where we come in, is, you know, we see this being weaponized against journalists. We see this information that's gathered through the sophisticated surveillance being used against journalists. It's given rise also to a surveillance industry, which has been linked in many cases to journalists who have been killed in Mexico, to Jamal Khashoggi. And we've got police departments, for example, in the United States using unregulated facial recognition technology, which could be used to identify protesters as well as journalists. And of course, we've got the Chinese surveillance state, which is now working in parts of Africa and in parts of Asia. And
the Israeli state as well involved in some of this, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Israeli state is interesting because they already had that capacity. And, you know, I've done some interviews with somebody who used to work for Shin Bet as well as with the Ministry of Health there. And it's you know, concerning the process that went around Shin Bet, but they've got two different processes. One which has oversight and review by the health ministry, where you have data that is kept on an individual's phone. You know, I don't want to get into the details of like technology of contact tracing, but there are right ways to do this and there are wrong ways to do it. The Europeans seem to be generally on the right approach, but, you know, we've got to put these safeguards in place. Otherwise it will be too late, as again, the Patriot Act and the millions of, you know, terrorism charges or thousands of terrorism charges that have been brought against individuals have proven in the past 2 decades.
I might just add here, and then we need to go to questions because we have several of them on standby, but you alluded to the report, Courtney. So for those of you who, and I'll try and put some links into the chat box as we talk, but Courtney was referring to the Perugia Principles for Journalists Working with Whistleblowers, which I wrote with Blueprint for Free Speech, which was based on collaborations with civil society organizations and consultations with international journalists. And it is a really useful, practical resource available in multiple languages, which you can find online. Many of those tips and tools can be used in the context of COVID-19. And I also wrote a book called Protecting Journalism Sources in the Digital Age for UNESCO, which was published in 2017. And I think what you'll find when you go to that is we thought we'd learned the lessons that Courtney's talking about post September 11, and then we go to the flashpoint of 2013 with Edward Snowden's revelations. We thought we learned the lessons there. And now in the context of COVID-19, we're having to reassert a lot of these practices. And I just would like to make the point, and this is being borne out in some of the data that we're seeing coming from the survey, that there is, while there is concern from journalists about the impacts on their sources of the fear of exposure connected to whistleblowing and revealing data, for example, connected to COVID-19, there is an absolute willingness to engage with new technologies in ways that alarm me. So, for example, the use of Zoom to have confidential source-based conversations, which I'm seeing emerge in our data set, is intriguing and problematic. So to me, and this is a bit of a soapbox moment, but so to me is the dismissiveness with which concerns about downloading contact tracing apps on phones has been met by many journalists, because there's a sort of patriotic response to the virus that somehow caused many journalists that I engage with to sort of to forget that a state is not necessarily benign, even when dealing with with a health crisis. And so while we can't get into the minutiae around these contact tracing apps, I think Courtney's point is to ensure that the responses are necessary, proportionate, and that there are useful guidelines that we can draw on to apply. And so some of the European examples are good. And Javier has also written widely on journalism, digital security issues and safety issues. There was a SEMA report you produced, Javier, which you might want to put a link to in the chat as well, which was incredibly useful. And I think we should move now to questions from our community, and then we can come back at the end if anyone has any other points they'd like to make. But the first question is from a Ghanaian journalist, Robert Taki Menson, who's a member of our Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. And his question is, what safety guidelines must journalists adopt when they're covering high risk zones in a COVID-19 context? Perhaps Courtney and Javier, this is a good one for you to respond to. You want to go first, Javier?
Thanks. Safety guidelines, well, it really depends on what kind of coverage you're going to be doing. But let's say you're going to a hospital, or you are going to places where you know that there is a high risk of contagion. Your basic precautions, even if you don't have a personal protective equipment, at least you get a face mask, maybe get goggles and gloves, or one of those plastic masks. That's just basic protection and basic hygiene protection, in terms of be careful what you touch at any moment before you get to an opportunity to wash your hands or to apply antibacterial gel. I found that basic hygiene procedures can go a long way, even if you are going into, let's say, hotspots, like a hospital or a clinic. If you are going to go beyond that, you do need to get more equipment, maybe the suit or a more complete equipment. The other thing is, and this is something that sometimes we miss it, is when you are going to go interact with people, you need to ask yourself, what is the likelihood of those people having contracted COVID-19, even if they don't know it, even if they don't show the symptoms? There was a debate last week over asymptomatic transmission, and whatever the technical issues, sometimes we tend to forget that people who seem to be perfectly fine can carry the virus and transmit it. So if you're a journalist, you are certainly a higher risk of that. And if you're a journalist that's talking to people who have been exposed to people that have been infected, we need to take into account, and we forget that. So every time we are going to go interview somebody, say a doctor or a health worker, we need to ask ourselves, what is the likelihood of that person having contracted COVID-19, even if they're asymptomatic? And so we need to keep our distance, maybe find alternative ways of interviewing that person, maybe over the phone, so we don't have to pay them a visit. because we need to do that assessment beforehand.
I would just add to that. I mean, definitely the basic is wash your hands. But you know, for journalists, it's very important to do a pre-assignment assessment. Understand what are the risks that you're going to face, because you know, if you're going out to do a report that doesn't involve going to a hospital, that doesn't involve that sort of thing, you're going to need a different type of personal protective equipment than you might need if you're going to cover a protest or you're going to have a one-on-one interview with somebody. So, it's very important to do that pre-assignment assessment. We have a bunch of safety guides, advisories on our website, including one about covering COVID that's updated on a regular basis by our safety experts, as well as the intersection of, for example, covering protests while covering COVID in the US or in India. So, check those out. And then I would also note that it's not just about what the journalists can do to keep themselves safe. It's also about what news organizations, and especially commissioning editors, when you're talking about freelancers who don't have necessarily access to the same resources. And so the ACOS Alliance, which I mentioned earlier, put out a set of safety guidelines and a resource toolbox for commissioning editors. IJNet, we wrote about it for IJNet, but there are a lot of resources. We're also doing a big series of webinars that are addressing safety, trauma, psychosocial, digital security issues. So lots of stuff happening out there. I think all of the websites, IJNet, CPJ, RSF, IPI, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. There are a lot of resources out there. If you can't find it, you can always connect with us on social media. We're trying to get those out as easily as possible. And if there's something that you need as a journalist or a news organization that's not out there, let us know.
And I think that underlines the point that people were making earlier, that there's ways of collaborating that are being pursued, that exceed what I've experienced before. I don't know about you guys, but it's pretty remarkable to see this level of cooperation from organizations that, sometimes can be a bit competitive. This is not a time for competition. This is a time for collaboration. So there's another question. I don't know if you've got a question you can see there. Emily, that you would like to ask. Otherwise,
I can't. So for some reason, I'm not seeing questions that you're seeing.
Okay. So. All right. Well, I'm going to ask.
Fire away.
So Virajana, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, Hirath from Sri Lanka. This person says that according to their experience of journalists who come from traditional media outlets, TV, newspaper, and radio, they're just reporting and don't have any major issues, but there are some problems with what this person is framing as new media journalists. Citizen journalists is the other term they're using, who are using their own channels to broadcast, webcast, and so on. So I guess this question is, how do legacy journalists, if you like, or traditional media outlets interact with and perhaps support citizen reporters? And I mean, there's particularly important underlying questions here around how news organizations and journalists use citizen reporters, or what's called UGC, user-generated content, when journalists can't physically go to the scene because their employers or their insurance won't allow it. Is there a problem there that we should be aware of in terms of our responsibility for the safety, not just of our sources, but of those communities that we're relying on to be our eyes and ears when we can't be there ourselves? I don't know, Zoe, if you'd like to respond to that one.
Julie, yes, I'm aware of a number of news outlets that make use of networks of, let's say, community radio broadcasters and their volunteers as eyes and ears on the ground. And in those instances, they do make provision for the safety of those people as far as they can. But we're also operating in an environment where there may not necessarily be a direct connection between the actual citizen journalist who is, sharing content directly at times on, a Facebook site or of a news outlet. But the concern, I think that the relationship largely in that respect would be in, let's say, a mainstream news organization using citizen journalists as sources of information, the important thing being the ethical implications and verifying that content. That is probably the most critical issue there.
Emily, did you have any comments on that?
Yes, I mean, we've done quite a lot of work on the ethics of handling UGC at the Tau Centre. And as Zoe was saying, it's really about what we're seeing in the field in terms of reporting is that, particularly within hospitals and places like that, you are having to train your sources to go and do the reporting that you would otherwise be doing. It's sometimes actually kind of a better and more ethical path than sending a journalist to that. And I think that, you know, what, I mean, this is cropping up in lots of new contexts, like, for instance, reporting from within closed groups in social media. You know, you have to think very carefully both about the ethics of that reporting, also about, you know, the kind of likely impact on your source of including them in a story. You know, even if they're willing to give you the material, do they fully understand the consequences of, particularly if it's a highly charged political situation like a demonstration, or one where there are lots of privacy issues at stake, like, you know, from within a hospital. Do people really understand, are they giving you proper informed consent? And again, just the basics of how are you storing that material? Who has access to it? You know, one of the things I think that journalists should always be on alert for is what happens when law enforcement authorities want access to the data that you have, and where have you gathered that? How have you kind of anonymized it? How have you kept it how have you kept the sources, whoever they may be, safe? And there's a much broader set of considerations when you're just dealing with, you know, a single whistleblower. I think that there's a very kind of well-established protocol for that. It's less well-established when you're dealing with you know, a torrent of material you may be taking from social media, or people even may be sending you directly. So I think that those are sort of, you know, those are all very important considerations. And actually there's a question here I have spotted from Maria Anderson.
Okay, good. I'm glad you saw that.
Yes, which is, you know, this one's for Courtney, I think, which is, how do we protect ourselves not from COVID-19, but from cops in America during demonstrations? And I have to say, as a European who's been often lectured in the decade that I've been here about how terrible our speech laws are, discovering that, for instance, local police departments often actually issue press credentials is quite a kind of, at the moment, particularly where there are great tensions between police departments and often the communities they're serving and the press. This has sort of thrown another problem, I think, into the reporting cycle. But that is a great question, which is, you know, how should American journalists protect themselves at the moment?
Can I just add a layer of COVID to that before Courtney responds? And that is, of course, we saw protests not just in the US, but in places like Brazil, connected to, you know, the opening up and wearing masks or not wearing masks. So this sort of protest aspect of the journalistic safety and media freedom question stretches from the Black Lives Matter movement and responses to it to COVID-19 and back again. So yeah, Courtney, what's your view on that?
Yeah, so we are, you know, recognizing that, you know, there are historic moments happening around the world, including in the US, where this really is an unprecedented movement over, you know, in most of our lifetimes. So we are providing safety advisories and guidance that is specifically geared at helping journalists protect themselves, both health-wise and in terms of covering these protests. So we put out actually a safety advisory around covering anti-lockdown protests, and then around covering police violence protests. And the thing is, those are different. We didn't see the level of police violence at the anti-lockdown protests that we saw at the anti-police brutality protests. So, you know, among the things that we had to recommend in terms of how to protect yourself from police violence was making sure that you were aware of the types of attacks that were happening. And that's why we worked closely with the US Press Freedom Tracker and all of its partners to document as many cases as we can. I mean, we are investigating with the tracker more than 400 cases of anti-press violence. We're categorizing those so that we understand, for example, arrests, the use of tear gas, rubber bullets, so that we can then provide safety guidance to people to help them understand how they protect themselves against the most likely threats. In terms of the role of kind of law enforcement in issuing credentials and just more broadly in this anti-press violence, first off, I would say, you know, we saw this issue of violence at protests is not new. It is something that we identified over the past several years, going back to Ferguson, Occupy Wall Street, the inauguration protests for President Trump. You know, protests are dangerous times for journalists, and they've gotten increasingly so as protesters want to control the narrative and tell their story, and law enforcement wants to do the same and be able to do their jobs without having to bother about the press. But I think what stands out here is the targeting of the press, especially despite the fact that in many cases they identified themselves as journalists. And in several cases, they were live on television or knew they were being captured on camera, and it still wasn't a deterrent. That is what is really scary. In terms of credentials, you know, we just had a call with one of the offices that oversees with the police departments where there was some violence. We are writing to police departments. We're submitting a formal input into the investigation happening by the Attorney General in New York. So we are documenting all these incidents and then asking for investigation into them, and of course for those people to be held accountable. It does seem that journalists are usually considered essential workers, and so they're exempt from quarantine or they're exempt from curfews, which we had in place here. But the fact is, you know, you have to translate that down into the level of that person, you know, on the front lines. We are calling for better police training. In terms of credentials, usually it depends on what, you know, event or what type of credential you're talking about. We in the United States don't have one overarching press credential, which goes back to the issue of citizen journalists. You know, there were citizen journalists who didn't have identifiable credentials. So we're talking to police departments about how you can make sure that freelance journalists or non-accredited journalists are still able to be out there reporting freely on these incredibly newsworthy events.
And I think that's where we'll leave. So I was going to say leave the questions, but I was about to come to you, Javier, in fact, and say, would you like to say something in conclusion, and then finally to you, Zoe?
Well, I would just conclude by picking up on what Courtney was saying about citizen journalists, and also about what Zoe was saying about how to rely on them. I think there is a big issue in the sense that citizen journalists can be either a great help for news organizations, or they can be a huge problem. Because we are also seeing, regrettably, a lot of citizen journalists, I wouldn't call them journalists, I would just call them people, who want to make the story about themselves. And so they report on them reporting whatever's going on, whatever the protest. So they go to the protest and take the selfie. They go to the hospital and take the selfie. And then they post on social media the story about how they are covering the story. And I think that can lead to a lot of problems, because it leads to misinformation. It leads to information that is not verified. And I think that going back to the original question, for a journalist, it becomes increasingly important to know how to discriminate between the people who really are trying to do a job and the people who are, you know, just putting information out there without, or putting stories out there without verifying them, or without actually reporting. The first can be a great help. I think the second need to be taken down as not taken down. They need to be verified as much as possible. You know, they're free to say whatever they want. The problem is that when they're out there saying whatever they want, they can spread a lot of misinformation, especially at the rate of followers that they have that is increasing. So I think we need to be careful in how we distinguish between both of them. So I would just close on there. The report that Julie mentioned, the link is posted. It's a bit outdated. That's from 4 years ago. But I think the main takeaway from that is something that we discussed here. sometimes tools that we think are safe are really not safe, and we use them thinking that they are secure when they're really not. So we need to dig down into the tools that we are using and find out whether they can really protect the activity that, that we're using them for.
I'll just add to that, just another data snapshot, very low response rates for those using Signal, which is a very secure, easy to use mobile-based app for secure communications, open source, which is the one that I recommend to people in journalism digital safety training. And another thing, there's a platform called Jitsi, which is a much more secure way to have video conferencing than, say, Zoom, despite the fact that I'm saying this ironically on a Zoom call.
It doesn't hold as many people, but you're right. It's
yes.
way more secure.
But this goes to, this goes to the point about risk assessment. There's a very minimal risk of doing a one-way webinar where you're controlling comments, you don't allow entry in, it's a public event. And I think we as professionals in this field need to be, clear on that. So we're not like saying one platform you can never use, the other. No, it's, you have to do the risk assessment.
Exactly.
Don't use Zoom. Right?
Which was precisely the point I was making. That's what people are identifying as the tool they use, the tools they're using for source communications. And I shouldn't laugh because I'm laughing out of shock. But you really, guys, this is an important message to take away from this this webinar, I think. And we get into habits, right? Where we're using Zoom every day in multiple different ways, and it becomes the normal channel for our communications rather than using it for what it's best for, which is exactly this, interactive conversations. And having recently witnessed a prestigious organization doing a webinar without proper security and seeing it Zoom bombed by people posting offensive messages, I'd have to say that there's also a risk attached to that you need to be aware of as well. Zoe, would you like to comment on anything that has been said by either the participants or those posting questions, just to close for us?
Thanks, Julie. No comment really on what's been said, but I want to leave you with two thoughts. We've had some, I think, a very good discussion on issues of safety and so forth. But I wanted to just emphasize that we tend to forget about the media development and the media support organizations that offer the support to the journalists in the field and the safety and security of those members of staff. And I just wanted to bring that to our attention, because at the end of the day, it's these people who are doing the campaigning around free expression and access to information, because you generally don't find journalists actually being active in the policy advocacy environment. And then the final thought is the one thing that I always come back to is the fact that in any situation where I've been involved with journalists in distress, I've found that solidarity is probably the most important gift that you can give a journalist in danger, in distress. And I have seen that solidarity again resurging, and the collaboration between partners, institutions, and individual journalists that I haven't seen in many years. I think that, again, is a takeaway of COVID-19.
That's fantastic. And Emily, do you have anything you'd like to say? And then I'll wrap.
No, I think that was a brilliant note to end on from Zoe. As you say, that we think about security sometimes in terms of laws and rules and tools and practice, but sometimes it's also just about those other things, like having a good network and all journalists reacting and supporting each other and pressing on the authorities to do better.
And organisations like CPJ and the Namibia Media Trust, and certainly ICFJ, working across media development, safety and freedom of expression. I think that's a really important point you made, Zoe. The work is hard and it can be exhausting. It can also be high risk. So there needs to be that collaboration. I'd just like to finish by pointing to two things. One is that on that very point, Zoe, we have at ICFJ a community called the Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, which you're all welcome to join if you're not currently members. That community is at the heart of the research we're doing, but it's also at the heart of ICFJ's response to COVID-19. And it provides opportunities for collaboration. It's now in multiple languages. So please find the link on our website. It's currently in Facebook page form, but is in the process of growing beyond that. And the final point is we've talked a lot here today about journalism safety, security, media freedom, critical independent reporting, and the need to keep it robust and alive. And it would be remiss of me in this context not to reference Maria Ressa and her colleague Ray Santos Jr., who were convicted on criminal charges just this week. Criminal libel charges, and we've referenced, in fact, the trend towards the weaponization of the law in reference to COVID-19. To an extent, there is the cloak of COVID-19 that has prevented the sort of scrutiny that we might like to have seen in reference to that court appearance. For example, only 3 journalists were allowed in the court. Maria's lawyers could not travel to be with her. So I think that case is one that we have to keep focus on. Despite the need to be, as a community, extremely vigilant around reporting on and protecting journalists covering COVID-19. Imagine being a journalist at Rappler right now in a country where there is a huge, which is where Maria Ressa and colleagues are based, where there is a huge risk and threat connected to COVID-19. To be putting yourself on the front line of that risk in combination with extrajudicial killings connected to a drug war, the threat of imminent arrest and imprisonment for up to 100 years in Maria's case. So ICFJ, along with many other international organizations, including CPJ and others, have condemned the charges against Maria Ressa and demanded that that they be dropped and that the conviction be overturned. And so I'd just like to leave you with that note and to continue encouraging solidarity in response to that. And a very somber note to end on, but hopefully it's also an inspiring note. We have to continue the fight. Thanks, everybody.
I would say.
Sorry, Courtney.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, everybody.
Say.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.